It's time now for The Clash. And today we were giving damning proof that the British Bashing Corporation's ageist and diversity-driven purge of its golden oldies on Radio 2 just isn't working. In fact, it's killing off the station. Official figures revealed that a staggering 580,000 listeners have switched off after the departures of Vanessa Feltz, Paul O'Grady, Simon Mayo, Steve Wright and most recently Ken Bruce, who was a fixture on the station for 31 years. Now, these veteran broadcasters have been replaced by the more woke and diverse crowd of Scott Mills, Michelle Visage, Rylan and DJ Spoonie. It seems the diversity-obsessed bosses need to wake up to their declining audiences before they're sort of broadcasting into the abyss. What do you think? Has the BBC's ill-judged diversity drive and ageist policies driven away 500,000 viewers and ruined Radio 2? Let me know your thoughts. Email me, Dan at gbnews.uk. Vote in our poll at GBNews. Those results coming shortly. But joining me now on this, former BBC war correspondent and MP Martin Bell, Britain's second longest-serving female national radio DJ until the BBC cruelly axed her, but we're glad to have her part of the GB News family now, Liz Kershaw, and the legendary former Radio 1 DJ and star Top of the Pops presenter, Mike Read. So look, Liz Kershaw, let me start with you, because actually you were a victim of what I believe is now an ageist policy, which has infiltrated BBC Radio, especially Radio 2. What do you think of these radars?
As soon as I started nudging 60, I got nervous. And, I was called in. And I was retired shortly after turning 62, just as Janice Long was before
And Vanessa
me.
Feltz. And Vanessa Feltz too.
Feltz, as soon as she touched 60, she was out. And she said on this morning, the ITV programme Live the other morning, after the announcements about Ken Bruce, that, yes, she'd sensed ageism, as I did. You know, it's sort of very subtle, but you get to feel like, oh, Liz, you're an old fogey, you know, you've no authority, you've no credibility, and it's very uncomfortable. So, yeah, I definitely looked at the figures, the radar figures this morning and thought, wow.
Because Mike Read... Yeah, Mike Read, what I find so disgraceful about this is that the BBC management don't seem to care about their massive group, the millions and millions of older folk who love Radio 2. Remember, the BBC have now forced over 75s to start paying the licence fee. But what, they don't believe that there should be presenters who they love? They're getting rid of music from the 60s and the 70s and the 80s on Radio 2, and they're moving much more towards music from the 90s and the noughties. Like, what's going on, Mike?
Well, that's a bit like taking books out of a library and saying you can't take anything out from the 40s, 50s, 60s or before that, including Shakespeare or the Bible.
Yeah, exactly.
So
no Beatles,
you can only have the modern stuff. So it is a bit like that. There's always been a natural cult. When Jimmy Young went, they said it'll never be the same. When Wogan went, it'll never be the same. So there is an element of that. And more stations, of course, now. There are more and more stations. But, yeah, the music is great. And the presenters, you know, like Liz is saying, you don't stop being good. You don't stop being passionate at whatever it is, whether it's music, whether it's carpentry, whether it's shipbuilding. You don't stop being good and you don't stop having a passion.
No, indeed. And Martin Bell, surely you must see that there is now... I mean, I know you are a big defender of the BBC, but surely you must see that there is now a trend that virtually every older presenter on BBC Radio, especially Radio 2, ends up being forced out.
Then surely you must see that you have a commercial interest in rubbishing the BBC. You do it every week for one reason or another. There comes a time in a broadcasting career when you have to move on. I certainly do. If you're in television, somebody will come and say, look, you got a face for radio. And if in radio, you can last a little bit longer. But this has been... Jimmy Young was a case in point. He left at 80 and there was a national outcry. Believe me, the BBC's figures are going to recover. The BBC has a reach and a popularity and a reputation which
Liz is shaking her head.
GB News cannot begin to match.
Liz is shaking her head. Liz, you come in.
Martin, I'm as passionate about the BBC as you are. I've spent 35 years on national radio, and before that on local radio. I believe in the BBC as a national broadcaster. But there are so many things wrong, and if people don't speak out about it, then they're not doing the job, as you've done in your career, speaking up and even standing as an MP against corruption. Well, I've been banging on since 1987 about equality in the BBC, because when I joined Radio 1, as Mike will know, there were 25 male DJs, and I was only the third in its 20-year history. It took the BBC 16 years to recruit its second woman, Janice Long. For the first 16 years, there was only Anne Nightingale for 2 hours on a Sunday. And that continued throughout my career until I wrote a report and questions were asked in the House of Commons, and Tony Hall declared that 50% of presenters must be female. Why is that important? Because nobody should be excluded from a job they're perfectly capable of doing on the grounds of sex, race, age, whatever. It should be, if you're good at it, you shouldn't. You see, they used to say things like, at Radio 1, they used to say, we can't have women on daytime Radio 1 because most of the listeners are female and they want the company of a man. You can't operate a desk, Liz, somebody said to me. You're just not biologically wired to operate a studio. I had to put up with all that crap for all those years. And only latterly have we had equality in the numbers of women. And we've now got women on daytime radio too. So the next thing was that they recruited June Sarpong as the diversity czar, £180,000 a year for 3 hours a week. And they would then issued this diktat that 20% of on-air people, whether they were presenters or guests, had to be non-white. And managers would not get promoted or their bonuses unless they achieved those targets. And that is what is going on now. Now, I think it's a good thing, because there was a time when the only black faces you saw at the BBC were the commissionaires on the desk. And once you went into the building, and Martin, you will know this is true, you did not see a black producer or a black presenter. So things have improved, times have changed, and that's for the better. And I completely agree with that. I think what's wrong is when perfectly good presenters who are popular with the people who are paying the tax, the licence fee, are retired.
Well, indeed. And Liz, you've made so many fascinating points there. But one I just want to pick up with Mike Read is the issue is, Mike, young people don't actually really want to listen to a traditional linear radio station, right? They're the streaming generation. They've got Spotify, they've got podcasts. They do self-curation. So actually what the BBC is doing is a bit delusional anyway. They're chasing this young audience that doesn't actually want them anymore, rather than focusing on the millions and millions of people who love Radio 2 and happen to be in their 60s and their 70s.
Yeah, you're quite right. That's why what I do is working, and I do the Heritage Chart, and it goes out around the world on TV, enormously popular for the heritage artists who are still making the best music they've made in their lives, but being ignored by people like Radio 2. So that is a problem. Yeah, a book came out a couple of years ago about why are BBC hemorrhaging young people. And I said, it's not just the BBC. Generally, every platform, younger people are looking and operating in a different way now. Because you're not going to woo them back by playing young music. It's like BBC local radio. You can play much younger music, but you're not going to woo them back. So there's this thing, when I listen to local BBC radio, which has always been very, very good, they're playing much younger music to a much older demographic. And the two don't quite sit somehow.
Martin Bell, why should, in this climate, the BBC continue to own and run Radio 1 and Radio 2? Surely it's time for them to be sold off.
Because the BBC is the national broadcaster. It is looked up to through the world. It has just celebrated and marked 100 years of achievement unmatched by any other broadcaster in the world. We should value it, we should cherish it, by all means reform it, but we must not let it go.
And keep older DJs on air?
Up to a certain point. There comes a time when you reach a certain age. I certainly did. In my case,
but what about Liz? I mean, look, she's just given the most eloquent, beautiful, impassioned defence of the BBC, and she's not allowed on because she's 63.
Well, I'm hardly on myself, but You know, we know where comes a time you'll let go. You learn to live with it and move on.
Liz, you're too old, according to Martin. Too old for the
No,
Bee.
she's not.
I have moved on, and I'm having the time of my life. But what I think is wrong is that it's about the music, and it's about experience and knowledge. And I took the trouble when I was writing an article about this for a newspaper 2 weeks ago to go through all the playlists of Radio 1, 2, 1 Extra, the Asian Network, 6 Music, and you won't believe now the overlap between Radio 1, 2 and 6. And they were supposed to be distinct.
They're chasing the youth. They are chasing the youth, and mark my words, they're ruining Radio 2. They're ruining Radio 2, the nation's best-loved station. But look, fascinating debate. Thank you so much. One of Britain's best-loved DJs there, Liz Kershaw, the former BBC war correspondent and MP, Martin Bell, and the legendary Radio 1 DJ and Top of the Pops presenter, Mike Read. But who do you agree with? Has the BBC's ill-judged diversity drive and ageist policies ruined Radio 2? Well, Michael on Twitter says the BBC misjudged quite a lot of things, it would seem. Yeah, they do. From Jabby, I was an avid listener for 35 years. The decline began with the departure of Dare Terry, Wogan, of course. Just awful now. Boom and Greatest Hits rule. These are the 2 new entrants to the market. Ken Bruce, going to one of them, of course. And from Howard, I think it is important to change presenters from time to time to keep it current. Your verdict is now in. Wow, this one's overwhelming. 95% of you agree that the BBC's ill-judged diversity drive and ageist policies has ruined Radio 2. Just 5% of you say they haven't.